The midday sun over Blackwood Junction didn't just shine. It hammered. It beat down on the rotting pine planks of the depot platform, baking the sap out of the wood until it splintered beneath Elias's worn leather boots. A single drop of sweat tracked a slow path through the fine layer of red dust coating his jaw. He reached into his vest pocket, fingers finding the pouch of loose tobacco. His thumbs, calloused and stained into the cracks with axle grease, worked the thin paper. He rolled the cigarette with mechanical precision. He struck a match against a rusted iron nail. The sulfur flared. He drew the flame in and exhaled a thin stream of blue smoke that hung stagnant in the windless air. Inside the glass booth, the station master's brass clock ticked, a heavy rhythmic click. Beside Elias, a faded tin sign swung on a groaning hinge. Elias kept his gaze locked on the eastern horizon, where the twin iron rails melted into a shimmering mirage. He didn't want a wife. He needed a hired hand. Someone to stretch barbed wire across 30 miles of dead pasture, someone to keep the deafening silence of the homestead at bay. A mail-order bride was a desperate man's gamble inked on cheap paper. The locomotive's whistle tore through the dry canyon, a low mourning wail. Black smoke plumed thick against the bleached sky. The wooden platform vibrated beneath Elias's boots. The iron beast pulled into the station, screeching metal against metal, spewing a blinding cloud of steam that tasted of sulfur and burning coal. The heavy brakes groaned. The massive steel pistons settled with a deafening hiss. The passenger car doors clattered open. A few men in dust-caked overcoats stepped down. Then she appeared. She stood hesitating on the iron step. She wore a high-collared gray wool dress far too heavy for the Texas furnace. A wide-brimmed felt hat pinned down tightly coiled dark hair. Her knuckles were bone white where she gripped a single leather valise. The hem of her dress was coated in soot. Elias chewed the inside of his cheek, the stubble scraping his collar. He took in her frame. Narrow shoulders, pale skin, city stock, the exact kind of woman the prairie wind would snap in half before the first frost. She stepped down. Her boot hit the dirt, kicking up a small, dry cloud. Elias dropped the remainder of his cigarette. He crushed the ember relentlessly beneath his heel, grinding the tobacco into the wood. He stepped off the platform. The anvil of heat pressed onto his shoulders. He stopped 3 paces from her. He didn't remove his hat. He simply stared, his eyes narrowed into slits against the glare. A slight breeze finally stirred, carrying the bitter scent of dry sagebrush. Clara looked up. Her eyes met his from under the brim of her hat. They did not waver. They were a stark, cold blue piercing through the grime on her cheeks. She swallowed hard. "Elias Thorne," she said. Her voice rasped raw with coal dust. Elias gave a slow nod. "Clara." He looked past her shoulder toward a heavy brass-bound wooden trunk the porter had dropped onto the dirt. "That yours?" he asked, his voice a low gravel grate. "Yes." Elias walked past her. He grabbed the thick leather handles. The muscles in his forearms coiled tight beneath his rolled-up sleeves as he hoisted the massive box onto his broad shoulder. It was heavy. Far too heavy for just dresses. The weight shifted with a dense metallic clunk inside. Elias didn't ask. He turned, walking toward the buckboard wagon hitched to a scarred roan gelding. Elias tossed the trunk into the back. The wagon's wooden bed groaned sharply. He untied the reins. Clara followed. She stood by the large wooden wagon wheel looking up at the high bench. She waited. Elias climbed up, wrapping the worn leather reins around his knuckles. He looked down at her. He kept his hands on the reins. "Climb up," he said. Clara tightened her grip on her valise. She placed a boot on the iron, spoke gripped the rough wooden siding, and pulled herself upward. Her breathing hitched for a fraction of a second from the exertion. She settled onto the hard wooden plank beside him, her spine completely rigid. Elias clicked his tongue. The leather reins slapped the roan's back. The wagon lurched forward, the iron-rimmed wheels crunching over sun-baked ruts. They left the station behind. The wooden buildings faded into the sprawling, cracked expanse of the dead basin. Mile after endless mile of nothing but sharp, sagebrush-bleached cattle bones and the unrelenting glare of the sun. They rode in absolute silence. The only sounds were the steady clopping of hooves and the dry wooden groan of the wagon. Elias kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. A mistake. That's exactly what sat beside him on the wooden bench. A fragile mistake that the desert would undoubtedly swallow whole before the month was out. The homestead sat in the center of a cracked depression. It was a collection of weathered gray timber leaning away from the prevailing wind. The porch roof sagged. The barn doors hung on rusted hinges. They shrieked a high metallic protest every time the hot draft caught them. Inside the cabin, the silence held a physical weight. It pressed against the eardrums. Elias woke before dawn. The air tasted of cold ash and stale wool. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his heavy boots scraping the warped floorboards. He didn't look toward the narrow cot in the corner of the main room. A thin wool blanket rose and fell there, keeping a slow, measured rhythm. He walked to the cast-iron stove. The metal was freezing to the touch. He shoved split kindling into the belly, struck a match against the stone chimney, and watched the orange light catch the dry wood. He set the blackened percolator over the heat. The smell of burnt chicory and bitter grounds slowly filled the cramped space. Elias poured a cup. Black. Thick as mud. He drank it standing by the single dusty window, watching the horizon turn a bruised purple. He set the tin cup down on the table. A dull clink. He grabbed his hat, pulled the brim low over his eyes, and walked out the door. By mid-morning, the heat radiating from the hard-pan dirt warped the air into shimmering waves. Elias stood by the corral, a heavy sledgehammer gripped in his leather-gloved hands. He swung. The iron head slammed into the thick wooden fence post. Wood splintered. Dirt flew. He swung again. The rhythm was brutal, a steady percussion of relentless labor. Sweat soaked through his faded flannel shirt, drawing a dark, wet line down his spine. The muscles in his neck strained tight like braided steel cords. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement. Clara walked from the house toward the cast-iron hand pump near the horse trough. She carried a large wooden bucket. The heavy gray dress she wore on the train was gone. She wore a faded canvas skirt and a plain cotton blouse. The hem dragged through the red dust. She grasped the iron handle of the pump. She pushed down. The metal groaned stiff with decades of rust. She threw her narrow shoulder into it, putting her entire body weight behind the downward motion. The pump gave a dry rasp. No water. Elias rested the sledgehammer against the post. He leaned his forearms on the top rail, watching the dust settle around his boots. Clara pulled the handle up, then shoved it down. Harder. A thin trickle of brown water spat from the iron mouth. She pumped again. Her breathing grew heavy, the sound carrying faintly across the dead, sun-baked yard. The wooden bucket took a long time to fill. When the water finally breached the rim, Clara stopped. She reached down to grasp the thick rope handle. She lifted. The bucket barely cleared the dirt. It swung splashing cold water against her leather boots. She took a step toward the house. Her shoulders hitched. She took another step. Elias narrowed his eyes against the piercing glare. He saw her grip slip. The heavy bucket hit the ground, spilling half its contents into the parched earth. The dry soil drank the water instantly, leaving nothing but a dark, muddy stain. Clara stood completely still. She didn't curse. She didn't cry out. She slowly lifted her hands, turning her palms upward in the harsh sunlight. Even from 30 yards away, Elias saw the raw, wet patches. The skin on her palms, unaccustomed to the rough hemp and rusted iron, had sheared away. Blood pooled in the torn blisters, bright and thick, dripping slowly down her wrists onto her canvas skirt. She stared at her hands for a long moment. Then she reached down, grabbed the wet rope with her bleeding fingers, and hauled the half-empty bucket toward the porch. She didn't look in his direction. Elias picked up his sledgehammer. The wooden handle felt slick under his glove. He turned back to the post. He swung the iron head, burying into the wood with a deafening crack. That evening, the cabin was suffocatingly hot. The low flame of the oil lamp cast long, flickering shadows against the log walls. They sat at the small pine table. A plate of salted beef and dry biscuits sat between them. The only sound was the scrape of metal forks against tin plates. Clara reached for her water glass. Her hands were wrapped in strips of torn white cotton. The blood had already seeped through the fabric, drying into stiff brown stains over her knuckles. Her fingers trembled slightly under the weight of the glass. Elias chewed the salted meat. It tasted like ash. He stared at the bandages. "Leave the water hauling," he said. The words tore out of his throat, rough and unused. Clara set the glass down. She met his gaze across the flickering lamp. Her blue eyes were flat, completely devoid of the surrender he expected to find. "The house needs water," she replied. Her voice was quiet, a low rasp that matched the dry wind outside. "I'll do it before sunrise," Elias stated. He leaned back in his wooden chair, the joints creaking under his weight. "You'll just bleed on the pump handle. Rusts the iron." He watched her jaw tighten. A tiny muscle fluttered near her temple. She didn't argue. She simply picked up her fork, gripping the cold metal tightly with her bandaged fingers, and took another bite of the dry biscuit. Elias looked away, staring at the dark window pane. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the mortar. He took a slow breath. He was right at the train station. She was paper. The desert was just figuring out exactly how long it would take to burn her down. The roan gelding snorted, its nostrils flaring as it shook its heavy mane against the biting horseflies. Elias rode the southern perimeter. The barbed wire stretched across the undulating plains, a thin, jagged line of rust dividing his dead grass from the open range. The morning air was already baking, tasting of alkali dust and dried sage. He spat over the saddle horn. The moisture hit the cracked earth and vanished into the pores of the soil. 2 miles down the line, near the dried-up creek bed, the roan halted. The horse's ears pinned flat against its skull. It gave a low, rattling whinny, its iron-shod hooves shifting restlessly, striking sparks against the loose shale. Elias pulled back on the leather reins. The leather groaned under the tension. He smelled it. A heavy, sweet metallic stench clinging to the stagnant air. Copper heat and raw meat. Elias swung his leg over the saddle. His boots hit the dirt with a heavy thud. He drew a slow breath, letting the grim scent fill his lungs, analyzing it. He walked forward, his right hand drifting naturally to rest on the worn wooden grip of the Colt strapped to his thigh. The leather holster creaked a solitary sound in the vast emptiness. A dense, vibrating cloud of black blowflies hovered near a weathered cedar fence post. Their collective hum sounded like a distant sawmill. Elias stepped through the tall, brittle weeds. A calf lay at the base of the post. Its eyes were rolled back, glazed over and clouded by the sun. Its throat was laid open. A single brutal slash cutting deep through the hide, severing the windpipe and muscle right down to the white vertebrae. The blood had cascaded down its chest, pooling into a thick, dark crust that bound the dust and gravel together into a hardened mass. Elias crouched. The joints in his knees popped. He kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning the shimmering heat waves for movement, before looking down at the kill. He traced the edge of the wound with his gaze. Not an animal attack. A blade. A very sharp, heavy blade wielded with practiced ease. He looked up at the fence line. The barbed wire, strung tight just yesterday, was severed. Two metallic strands curled inward, the cut ends, shining a bright, raw silver where heavy iron snips had bitten through the steel. Vance. The name tasted like ash in Elias's mouth. Vance's riders didn't leave paper notices. They communicated in blood and broken fences. They were starving the small ranchers out one poisoned well, one slaughtered animal at a time. Elias looked at the ground. 3 sets of horseshoe prints marred the dust. Deep, sharp impressions indicating heavy riders. They hadn't run. They had moved at a slow, deliberate walk, turning their horses right at the property line. They wanted him to read the tracks. They wanted him to feel the slow tightening of the noose. Elias grabbed the calf by its stiffened hind legs. The muscles in his back coiled and locked. He hauled the carcass backward. The dead weight dragged through the dirt, leaving a wide, dark smear across the pale earth. He pulled it deep into the mesquite brush out of sight of the house. The flies followed him in a dark, swirling halo. He mounted the roan and turned back. When he rode into the dusty yard, the sun hammered down relentlessly. Clara stood on the porch. She held a coarse straw broom, sweeping the loose dirt off the warped pine planks. Her rhythmic movements slowed, then stopped completely. She looked down at Elias's boots as he dismounted. The scuffed leather was coated in a dark, wet grime. A few stray blowflies buzzed stubbornly around his spurs. Elias didn't speak. He tied the reins to the hitching post with quick, sharp tugs. He walked past her, his heavy footsteps echoing hollowly on the porch. He stepped into the dim, stifling heat of the cabin. He walked straight to the iron gun rack bolted above the stone fireplace. He lifted the Winchester repeater. The oiled walnut stock felt dense and comforting in his calloused hands. Clara stepped into the doorway. The bright light from outside framed her narrow silhouette. The broom handle rested loosely against her hip. She watched him pull a grease-stained rag from his vest pocket. Elias sat at the heavy oak table. He laid the rifle flat. He began wiping down the blued steel barrel. His movements were slow, methodical, and completely silent. He picked up a cardboard box of ammunition. He thumbed a brass cartridge into the loading gate. The metallic click snapped through the quiet room. He fed another. Snick. Another. Snick. Clara watched the brass casings catch the faint light of the room. She looked at the dark stains drying on his boots, then back up to the rigid set of his jaw. She did not ask what he had found in the brush. She did not ask who the bullets were for. She turned her back to the dim cabin and faced the glaring empty plains. The sound of her broom bristles scraping against the wood resumed. A steady, deliberate scrape against the boards matching the metallic clicks from the table inside. The iron hand pump screamed a dry metallic protest. Clara threw her entire weight onto the rusted handle, driving it downward. A hollow thud echoed from the depths of the iron pipe. She pulled up the muscles in her back, straining against the coarse cotton of her dress, and pushed down again. A ragged gasp of air spat from the spout, followed by a thick, rust-colored sludge. It splattered against the bottom of the oak bucket. The smell of wet clay and deep earth rose into the stifling air. Clara stopped. She rested her forehead against her forearm. The sweat ran down her temples, carving clean tracks through the fine layer of red dust coating her skin. She looked down into the bucket. 2 inches. 2 inches of brown, silty water. It took 20 minutes of backbreaking labor to draw what used to flow in 3 effortless pumps. The water table was dropping. The earth was closing its veins. Out in the pasture, the remaining cattle stood clustered beneath the sparse shade of a solitary mesquite tree. Their ribs pushed hard against their hides. They didn't low. They simply stood, heads hung low, conserving the last of their moisture. Elias watched from the barn. He held a steel rasp, dragging it across the splintered edge of a broken wagon spoke. The wood shavings fell into the dirt. He wiped the back of his neck with a grease-stained rag. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He looked toward the well. He saw Clara lift the heavy oak bucket, her bandaged hands gripping the hemp rope. She didn't stumble. She walked with a slow, agonizing precision toward the house, ensuring not a single drop sloshed over the rim. Nightfall brought darkness, but no relief from the heat. The air inside the cabin stagnated thick with the smell of old wood and kerosene. Elias sat on the front porch. The sway-backed rocking chair creaked under his weight. The Winchester 1873 lay across his thighs. His right hand rested on the receiver index finger, hovering a fraction of an inch from the trigger guard. The darkness beyond the porch stretched endlessly, an ocean of black sagebrush and sharp rocks. He rolled a cigarette. His thumbs, cracked and ingrained with dirt, worked the paper blindly. He struck a match on his boot heel. The sulfur flared, casting harsh, flickering shadows across his face. Deep ravines carved through the stubble on his cheeks. Heavy bruised pouches hung beneath his eyes. He hadn't slept a full night since he found the slaughtered calf. He inhaled the sharp tobacco smoke burning the back of his throat. He blew it out into the windless night. He listened. The desert was never truly quiet. A coyote yipped from a distant ridge. The dry timber of the roof contracted with a sharp crack. A kangaroo rat scurried through the dry weeds near the steps. Elias filtered the sounds, separating the natural from the unnatural. He listened for the snap of a boot on a dry twig, the muffled clinking of a horse's bit, the heavy silence of a disturbed flock of quail. The screen door whined. A soft click of the iron latch followed. Clara stepped onto the porch. She wore a faded wool shawl draped over her shoulders. She held 2 tin mugs. Thin wisps of steam curled from the dark liquid inside. She walked to the railing. Her footsteps were light but deliberate. She didn't try to hide her presence. She held out a mug. Elias took it. His calloused knuckles brushed the side of her hand. Her skin felt like rough canvas. She didn't retreat into the relative safety of the cabin. She pulled a wooden apple crate near his chair and sat down. She looked out into the exact same patch of impenetrable blackness that held Elias's gaze. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional creak of Elias's rocking chair. Elias shifted his weight. He studied her profile in the faint starlight, the sharp angle of her jaw, the straight, unyielding line of her posture. He waited for the questions. He waited for her to ask why he sat in the dark with a loaded rifle. He waited for the subtle tremors of panic to rack her narrow shoulders. Nothing came. Her breathing maintained a slow, even cadence. She took a sip of the bitter ground's heavy coffee. She didn't flinch at the taste. She simply swallowed and lowered the mug to her lap. "The well is pulling mud," she stated. Her voice was flat, a simple reporting of facts. "I know," Elias rasped. "It won't last the week." "I know." Clara turned her head. Her pale eyes caught the faint glow of his cigarette ember. She looked at the Winchester resting on his legs. She looked back to the tree line. "Then we boil the mud," she said. Elias stopped rocking. He stared at her for a long moment. The wind picked up, swirling a fine mist of topsoil over the porch. It coated the rifle barrel. It settled into the coarse wool of Clara's shawl. The dust covered them both equally. Elias took another drag of the cigarette. He flicked the glowing stub into the yard. It arced through the dark, hit the dirt, and died. He racked the lever of the Winchester a quarter-inch, feeling the brass cartridge seat firmly in the chamber. The metallic snick snapped through the night air. Clara didn't blink. She raised her tin mug, took another slow sip, and continued watching the dark. The afternoon baked the earth into a cracked ceramic plate. A column of ochre dust rose in the east, smudging the sharp line of the horizon. It moved steadily toward the homestead, thick and deliberate. Elias stood by the chopping block. The heavy iron axe bit deep into a piece of split mesquite. He left it buried in the wood. He wiped his brow with the back of his canvas sleeve, leaving a streak of dark grease across his skin. He watched the dust column thicken. The rhythmic thumping of iron-shod hooves rolled across the hardpan. It was a low, heavy vibration that traveled through the crust of the earth and up through the thick leather soles of his boots. 5 riders. They kept a measured trot, their silhouettes rippling black against the severe glare of the sun. Elias walked to the porch. He picked up the Winchester 1873 from the wooden bench. He didn't rack the lever. He didn't check the loading gate. He gripped the worn walnut stock, the metal warm against his calloused palm. He walked down the warped wooden steps, his spurs chiming a dull, muted note in the dead air. He walked out to the dirt yard and stopped exactly 10 yards from the property line where the barbed wire lay severed. He stood with his boots planted wide. The rifle rested easily across his forearms. The riders hauled back on their reins. The horses danced, tossing their heavy heads, white foam flecking their iron bits. Their flanks heaved slick with dark, foamy sweat. The smell of lathered horseflesh, oiled leather, and stale chewing tobacco rolled forward on the stagnant breeze. The man in the center rode a massive, deep-chested black stallion, Silas Vance. He wore a tailored charcoal suit coat, heavy and dark, entirely unsuited for the Texas furnace. A thick silver watch chain draped across his gray vest, catching the brutal sunlight. He chewed a wad of tobacco, his jaw working in a slow, grinding circle. The 4 men flanking him sat slouched in their saddles. Their hands rested casually near the walnut grips of their revolvers. Vance leaned forward, crossing his thick forearms over the tooled leather saddle horn. The saddle leather groaned a heavy, agonizing protest under his shifting weight. He spat a stream of dark brown juice into the dust. It sizzled faintly, leaving a dark, wet crater. "Afternoon, Elias," Vance said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone that coated the dry air like molasses. Elias kept his gaze locked on Vance's chest. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. He simply stood a monument of faded denim and tense muscle. Behind Elias, the cabin's screen door gave a high, thin whine. Clara stepped onto the porch. She held a damp rag in one hand. She stopped by the railing, her posture completely rigid. She watched the 5 heavy horses tear up the dirt at the edge of the property. She didn't retreat into the shadows. Vance's pale eyes flicked toward the porch, lingering on Clara for a fraction of a second, before returning to Elias. A slow, thin smile stretched across his face, not quite reaching his eyes. "Tough country for a woman." Vance noted his tone, conversational. "Hard on the hands, hard on the spirit, especially when the well starts pulling up nothing but clay and the calves start tripping over their own throats." Elias's jaw tightened. A single drop of sweat tracked down the deep crease of his cheek. The knuckles of his right hand whitened around the receiver of the Winchester. Vance reached into the breast pocket of his heavy coat. He drew out a folded piece of thick, cream-colored paper. He held it between his thick fingers, letting the edge flutter slightly in a sudden hot draft. "I came to do you a favor, Elias." A neighborly gesture, Vance continued. He tapped the paper against his saddle horn. "Got a deed of sale right here. Fair price. More than fair considering the string of bad luck you've been having. Enough to buy 2 tickets on the eastbound train. Take the little lady back to somewhere the water flows out of a brass tap." The silence stretched. A large horsefly buzzed aggressively around the black stallion's ears. The horse shook its massive head, the bridle chains clinking sharply. Elias looked at the paper. He looked at the 4 armed men flanking Vance. He looked back at Vance. Elias shifted his right hand. His thumb found the hammer of the Winchester. He pulled it back. Clack, clack. The metallic double click of the sear engaging cut through the heavy air with the precision of a guillotine blade. It was the only answer he offered. The barrel of the rifle remained pointed at the dirt, but the tension in Elias's shoulders coiled tight, ready to snap the weapon up in a fraction of a second. Vance stopped chewing. The thin smile vanished from his face, leaving a hard, flat mask of contempt. He stared at the cocked hammer. He stared at the cold, dead look in Elias's eyes. Vance slowly folded the cream-colored paper. He slid it back into his breast pocket. He picked up his leather reins. "Suit yourself, Elias." Vance murmured, his voice dropping the false warmth. "The desert takes what it wants. Always does." He pulled the stallion's head around. The heavy horse pivoted, kicking a spray of red gravel toward Elias's boots. The 4 riders followed suit, their horses bumping shoulders as they turned back toward the east. Elias watched them ride away. He didn't uncock the rifle until the dust column swallowed them completely, leaving the homestead in a suffocating, ringing silence. The moon offered no light. The basin lay entombed in a suffocating, ink-black void. The air hung stagnant, retaining the brutal heat of the afternoon sun. Elias sat on the warped wooden bench of the porch. The Winchester rested across his thighs. He kept his eyes open, staring into the impenetrable dark, but the exhaustion was a physical weight crushing his skull. His eyelids turned to lead. The constant grinding hypervigilance gnawed at his nerve endings. He allowed his eyes to close for a fraction of a second. A singular, dangerous heartbeat of rest. The scent of raw kerosene crept over the floorboards. Elias snapped his eyes open. An orange hue bled into the periphery of his vision, reflecting off the cracked glass of the cabin window. It wasn't the soft glow of a lantern. It was an aggressive, pulsing light. A sharp, violent crackle fractured the silence, followed by the heavy, rushing roar of an updraft catching dry timber. He lunged off the bench. The heavy wooden chair clattered backward against the log wall. The barn was a solid wall of fire. Flames licked up the weathered gray siding, feeding greedily on the decades of dry rot and dust. The roof shingles curled and blackened, spitting embers high into the windless night sky like a swarm of malicious fireflies. Thick, oily black smoke billowed from the hayloft. Inside the blazing structure, the roan gelding gave a high, rattling shriek. It was a sound of pure, primal agony. Elias dropped the rifle in the dirt. He ran. His heavy boots pounded across the hardpan, kicking up a trailing cloud of dust. The heat hit him 30 yards out. It was a solid physical barrier pressing against his chest, stealing the oxygen from his lungs. The air tasted of burning pitch and scorched manure. He reached the sliding double doors. The wood was blistering, the old white paint bubbling and turning to black crust. He threw his right shoulder against the timber. He grabbed the heavy iron handle. The metal seared straight through his thick leather work glove. He gritted his teeth, tasting copper, and hauled backward. The rusted track shrieked. The door gave way, opening a jagged maw into the inferno. A backdraft of superheated air slammed into him, singeing the stubble on his jaw and melting his eyelashes. Elias pulled his canvas collar over his mouth and waded into the fire. The interior was a chaotic nightmare of dancing shadows and blinding orange light. The roar of the flames deafened him, sounding like a runaway freight train barreling through a tunnel. Flaming chunks of hay dropped from the loft, igniting the dry straw covering the dirt floor. He found the roan in the first stall. The horse was completely unhinged. It reared its heavy iron hooves, striking the wooden partition, splintering the burning boards. Its eyes rolled entirely white. White foam sprayed from its muzzle, hissing as it hit the burning straw. Elias didn't use soft words. He didn't try to calm the beast. He used brutal, overwhelming force. He ducked under a flailing hoof. He slammed his body weight against the horse's flank, pinning the massive animal against the wall for a split second. He reached up his hand, closing over the leather halter. The leather was slick with the horse's sweat. He twisted his fist into the straps, locking his grip. He pulled. The muscles in his back and shoulders coiled, straining against the raw panic of a 1,200-pound animal. The horse fought him, tossing its massive head, dragging Elias's boots through the burning embers. "Move!" Elias roared the sound, tearing his ash-coated throat. He yanked the halter downward, forcing the gelding's head low beneath the thickest layer of blinding smoke. He dragged the beast out of the stall and toward the open door. Above them, the main support beam groaned. A sound like a snapping spine echoed through the barn. Elias shoved the roan through the doorway out into the dirt yard. He turned back. The two older workhorses were trapped in the rear stalls, walled off by a collapsing wall of fire. He took a step forward. The roof caved in. A shower of burning timber and molten iron nails crashed down exactly where Elias had stood a second before. A wave of concussive force knocked him backward. He hit the dirt outside the doors, sliding across the hardpan. A jagged, burning splinter of pine struck his right shoulder, igniting the fabric of his flannel shirt. Elias rolled in the dust. He smothered the flame with his left hand, crushing the burning wood into the earth. He stayed on his hands and knees. His lungs heaved violently, rejecting the thick black smoke. He coughed a deep, rattling hack that tasted of blood and soot. The right side of his face throbbed with a sickening tight heat. The flesh on his right shoulder burned with a sharp, localized agony. He looked up. The barn was entirely gone. It was just a skeletal cage of flaming timbers collapsing in on itself. The two workhorses were silent. Footsteps crunched in the gravel behind him. Clara dropped to her knees in the dirt beside him. She wore her faded wool shawl pulled tight over her nightgown. Her bare feet were caked in red dust. She held a thick, heavy burlap sack dripping with the silty, mud-thick water from the dying well. She didn't speak. She didn't offer a trembling hand or a shallow word of comfort. She simply pressed the soaking cold burlap hard against the scorched flesh of his right shoulder and the side of his neck. The cold water hissed against his skin. Elias gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw bunching into hard knots. He didn't pull away. They knelt together in the dirt. The raging fire cast their long, dark shadows across the barren yard. The heat baked the moisture out of their clothes. Elias stared at the glowing embers, the realization settling over him like a heavy iron shroud. Vance hadn't just burned a building. He had destroyed their tools, their feed, and their only means of pulling a wagon. The noose wasn't just tightening anymore. It was completely draw. Dawn broke like a rusted blade slicing through the eastern horizon. It cast long, grotesque shadows across the homestead. The barn was a blackened, smoldering scar upon the earth. Thin tendrils of gray smoke still spiraled upward from the charred bones of the roof beams, carrying the sickening, sweet stench of roasted flesh and burnt hair across the dead pasture. Inside the cabin, the air hung heavy and still. Elias sat at the heavy oak table. The right sleeve of his flannel shirt was gone, severed at the seam by a hunting knife. Thick strips of white cotton torn from a clean bedsheet bound his right shoulder and collarbone. The fabric clung tightly to his skin, already weeping a faint pale yellow fluid from the blisters beneath. Every shift of his weight sent a jagged spike of white-hot agony down his spine. He kept his jaw locked. He did not grunt. He reached across the table with his left hand. He dragged the heavy canvas saddlebag toward him. The coarse fabric scraped across the wood. He opened the brass buckles. He emptied the contents onto the table. A handful of loose brass cartridges spilled out, clattering against the pine boards. Elias separated them with slow, methodical sweeps of his calloused fingers. He built small, neat pyramids. 24 rounds of .44-40 for the Winchester 1873. 12 rounds of .45 Colt for the revolver on his hip. 6 heavy red paper shells of double-aught buckshot for the battered side-by-side shotgun leaning against the stone hearth. It was a pitiful arsenal, a dead man's abacus. Elias picked up a brass casing. He rolled the cold metal between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the heavy lead bullet seated at the rim. He knew Vance's numbers. He had seen 5 riders yesterday. There would be more tonight. Vance wouldn't risk another standoff. He would come to completely eradicate the problem. He would come under the cover of darkness, with enough firepower to turn the log cabin into splinters. Elias grabbed a rag stained with black oil. He picked up the Colt Peacemaker. He flipped the loading gate open. He spun the cylinder. The metallic clicking was crisp and rhythmic, a sharp metronome ticking away the final hours of daylight. He wiped down the blued steel, removing the fine layer of abrasive red dust that had settled over the night. He worked in absolute silence. The ritual of cleaning the steel grounded him. It was a familiar mechanical process that left no room for the paralyzing dread that hovered at the edges of his consciousness. He accepted the math of the situation. He would kill as many as he could when they crossed the tree line. Then the house would burn, and he would burn with it. He finished the revolver and slid it back into the leather holster on his thigh. He stood up. The muscles in his right shoulder screamed, locking tight in protest. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracking through the soot on his face. He ignored it. He walked out the back door toward the makeshift corral. The roan gelding paced near the split-rail fence. The animal's coat was matted with dried sweat and ash. It snorted nervously, pawing at the hard-pan dirt, the trauma of the fire still vibrating through its heavy frame. Elias approached slowly. He kept his hands low. He grabbed the frayed lead rope. With his good arm, he hauled the heavy western saddle off the fence rail. He swung it over the horse's broad back. The saddle landed with a dull, heavy slap. The roan flinched, laying its ears flat, but held its ground. Elias reached under the belly, grabbed the latigo, and cinched the girth tight. He pulled it hard, anchoring the leather firmly to the beast. He tied a canvas canteen to the saddle horn. He strapped a tightly rolled wool blanket behind the cantle. He added a small canvas sack containing the last heavy bricks of salted beef and a dozen hard biscuits. He led the saddled horse around the side of the cabin to the front porch. Clara stood by the steps. She had washed the worst of the black soot from her face, but her faded dress still bore the dark, greasy stains of the night's labor. Her hands, still wrapped in dirty bandages, rested motionless by her sides. She watched Elias approach. Her pale blue eyes tracked the heavy saddlebags, the filled canteen, the tightened girth. Elias stopped at the base of the wooden steps. He held the worn leather reins out toward her. "Take him," Elias said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly scrape, completely devoid of emotion. Clara looked at the leather straps in his hand. She did not reach for them. "Ride straight south," Elias commanded, his tone hardening, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Keep the sun on your right shoulder. Do not stop at the creek bed, it's a bottleneck. Push him hard across the salt flats. You will hit the iron tracks by dusk. Follow them east into Blackwood Junction." He reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a small, heavy leather drawstring pouch. The dull clinking of silver coins sounded from within. He tossed it onto the porch. It landed at her feet with a heavy thud. "There's enough silver in there for a train ticket to St. Louis. Buy the ticket. Get on the car. Don't look out the window." Clara stared down at the pouch. The wind stirred, kicking up a small eddy of gray ash from the ruined barn, dusting the toes of her boots. "Vance will come when the sun drops," Elias stated. He looked past her, fixing his gaze on the shimmering, distorted horizon. "He won't leave witnesses, and he won't stop at the property line this time. The cabin will not stand." He thrust the reins forward again, the leather slapping against the wooden railing. "Take the horse, Clara, go." He didn't wait for her to grab the leather. He dropped the reins over the hitching post. He turned his back to her, his boots grinding heavily into the dirt, as he walked back toward the dark, suffocating interior of the cabin. He had a rifle to oil and a grave to dig. The brass pendulum of the wall clock swung behind glass, a heavy, relentless chop slicing the silence of the cabin into fractions. Elias sat rigid at the oak table. He kept his eyes locked on the front window, waiting for the rhythmic thud of the roan's hooves carrying the woman away. He waited for the sound of his own solitary doom to settle over the homestead. The wind whistled through the cracked mortar of the log walls. A thin layer of white ash drifted across the floorboards. No hooves. The porch boards groaned under a light, deliberate weight. The rusted hinges of the front door shrieked a high, metallic protest. Clara stepped over the threshold. The heavy canvas saddlebag hung off her left shoulder, dragging slightly against the doorframe. She walked straight to the table. She dropped the leather pouch of silver coins onto the pine boards. The heavy thud rattled Elias's neatly stacked ammunition pyramids. Elias looked up. The muscles in his jaw corded tight. A dangerous cold fury darkened his bruised eyes. "I gave you an order!" He rasped the words, tearing through his smoke-ruined throat. Clara ignored the venom. She let the saddlebag slide from her shoulder to the floor. She walked past the table, heading for the foot of the narrow cot in the corner. The heavy, brass-bound wooden trunk sat exactly where Elias had dropped it weeks ago. Elias gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Vance isn't coming to talk. He's coming to slaughter. You stay in this house, you burn with it." Clara knelt on the dusty floorboards. She reached into the high collar of her dress and pulled out a long, heavy iron key strung on a rawhide cord. "I've burned before," she said. Her voice held no tremor. It was absolute zero. She slid the iron key into the brass lock. It turned with a heavy, oiled click. She unlatched the two thick side clasps. They snapped upward like breaking bone. She gripped the thick leather handles and threw the heavy oak lid back. It hit the log wall with a dull thud. Elias watched her narrow back. He expected the rustle of petticoats, the scent of lavender soap, the useless artifacts of a fragile city life. Instead, a sharp chemical odor flooded the stagnant air of the cabin. It smelled of sulfur, saltpeter, and dense machine grease. It was the scent of a deep shaft mine. Clara reached deep into the trunk. She hauled out a heavy canvas-wrapped bundle, the tendons in her forearms straining, and dropped it onto the floorboards. A dense metallic clatter echoed through the room. She stripped the coarse canvas back. Elias stopped breathing. Stacked inside the cloth were 6 thick cylinders of commercial blasting dynamite, their heavy wax paper casings sweating a faint, oily sheen. Beside them lay a wooden crate no larger than a cigar box, packed tight with brass blasting caps. Spools of thick copper wire coated in cracked black rubber sat nested against heavy iron pliers and a pair of steel crimpers. Clara reached back into the trunk. Her bandaged hands moved with terrifying mechanical precision. She lifted out 2 glass mason jars filled with a thick, viscous amber fluid. She set them gently on the floor. Finally, she withdrew a sawed-off 10-gauge double-barrel shotgun. The walnut stock was wrapped tight in frayed friction tape. The twin barrels were cut down to a brutal, gaping 8 inches. She stood up. She carried the blasting caps, a spool of wire, and the heavy iron crimpers to the oak table. She swept Elias's carefully arranged brass cartridges aside with the back of her forearm, clearing a wide, empty space on the wood. Elias stared at the lethal spread. He looked from the sweating dynamite to her pale, impassive face. The suffocating pain in his burned shoulder momentarily vanished beneath a sharp, cold spike of adrenaline. "What are you?" he breathed. Clara pulled a wooden chair out and sat. She unwound a length of copper wire, the stiff metal fighting her calloused fingers. "My father was a powder monkey in the deep anthracite shafts of the Monongahela." She said, her eyes fixed entirely on the wire. "He breathed coal dust and lived on company scrip. He knew how to bring down a mountain with a single spark." She picked up the heavy steel crimpers. She bit the wire off with a sharp, brutal snap. When the company men came to break the miners' strike, they didn't bring paper edicts. They brought repeating rifles and kerosene. They locked the camp gates. They fired the canvas tents with the women and children inside. She paused. She picked up a small brass blasting cap. She held it up to the fading light leaking through the dirty window pane, inspecting the hollow cylinder. "My father didn't run. He opened the powder magazine." She slid the raw copper wire into the open end of the brass cap. She positioned the heavy steel crimpers just above the volatile fulminate base. With a swift, unapologetic squeeze of her bandaged hands, she clamped the metal tight. A perfect, airtight seal. A fraction of an inch too low, and the pressure would have detonated the cap, taking 3 of her fingers with it. She didn't even blink. "He taught me the math of pressure and containment," Clara continued. She set the primed cap gently onto the pine table. It landed with a soft, deadly click. "He taught me that you don't fight fire with water when the well is dry. You fight it with a bigger blast." Elias slowly leaned back in his chair. He looked at her hands. The deep blisters and torn skin weren't just from a rusted pump handle. They were the weathered, scarred tools of a woman who had lived her entire life in the shadow of detonators and shrapnel. The fragile city girl was an illusion. Clara reached for the next piece of wire. "Vance thinks he's riding into a slaughterhouse," she said. Her pale blue eyes finally rose to meet Elias's stare. A dark, terrifying resolve settled over her sharp features, harder than the steel she held. "He is. But he's not the butcher." The sun bled out over the western ridge, leaving a bruised purple scar across the sky. The temperature did not drop. The heat simply changed from a glaring anvil to a suffocating heavy blanket. Inside the cabin, Clara moved with the cold, deliberate efficiency of a mortician. She laid 3 sticks of sweating dynamite on the pine table. The wax paper casings felt slick and dense. She wrapped them in thick friction tape. The adhesive rasped a harsh ripping sound against the silence. She took the primed blasting cap and inserted it deep into the center stick, securing the joint with a tight wrap of hemp twine. She picked up the bundle. She handed it to Elias. "Under the porch steps," she instructed. Her voice was a dry, mechanical rasp. "Bury it deep enough to hide the wax. Leave the wire exposed. Bring the line up through the floorboards." Elias took the heavy package. The volatile weight settled into his palm. He walked out the front door. The evening air tasted of alkali dust and impending violence. He knelt by the warped wooden steps. The torn flesh of his burned shoulder screamed, driving a white-hot spike of agony down his collarbone. He locked his jaw. He ignored the fire in his own skin. He dug into the hardpan dirt with a rusted iron trowel. The parched earth fought back, yielding only in small, dry flakes. He scraped out a shallow trench in the deepest shadows of the steps. He laid the dynamite inside. He covered it carefully with loose red dust, smoothing the surface flat with his calloused palm. He trailed the thick black rubber wire up the side of the wooden pilings, threading suddenly it through a wide knothole near the doorframe. Clara emerged from the cabin. She carried a heavy iron spade and one of the glass mason jars. The viscous amber fluid sloshed heavily against the glass. She walked to the center of the dirt yard, exactly where a group of riders would naturally rein in to survey the house. She drove the spade into the dirt. Her strikes were rhythmic and brutal. She dug a narrow hole, placing the jar inside so only the brass lid sat flush with the ground. She pulled a spool of unraveled copper wire from her apron pocket. The wire was thin, practically invisible in the fading twilight. She stretched it taut across the gap between the hitching post and the dead trunk of a lightning-struck oak. Elias watched her anchor the wire. She secured the end to a heavy iron friction match, resting the red sulfur head directly against a strip of coarse sandpaper, nailed to the dry bark. "They hit the wire the match strikes," Clara said. She didn't look up from her work. "The spark catches the vapor. The jar shatters. The fluid burns at 400 degrees. Elias gave a slow nod. The precision. The utter lack of hesitation. She wasn't just building traps. She was calculating the exact geometry of a massacre. He walked to the side of the house. A half-empty barrel of lamp oil sat against the log wall. He tipped the heavy iron drum onto its rim. He rolled it toward the rear of the cabin, maneuvering it to the base of the back door, the only other point of entry. He pulled his heavy hunting knife from his belt. He drove the thick steel blade into the thin metal near the base of the barrel. He twisted the blade, widening the gash. Black oil wept from the puncture. It pooled into the parched earth, spreading into a dark, slippery snare across the back step. The sharp chemical stench of kerosene rose into the stagnant air. The last of the ambient light died. The basin plunged into an absolute suffocating blackness. Inside the cabin, they extinguished the single kerosene lamp. Total dark. The only illumination came from the faint, cold starlight bleeding through the dirty window panes. Clara knelt on the floorboards directly beneath the front window. She arranged the raw ends of the copper wires onto a dry pine plank. She placed a heavy square dry cell battery beside them. She didn't connect the terminals. She left a fatal half-inch gap. Her bandaged fingers rested motionless on the wood, hovering inches from the raw copper. Elias sat in a heavy oak chair positioned in the darkest corner of the main room. The Winchester 1873 rested across his thighs. The Colt Peacemaker sat loose in its leather holster. He felt the familiar cold weight of the oiled steel under his fingertips. He looked across the dark room at Clara's silhouette. She sat with her back against the wall. The sawed-off 10-gauge rested on her knees. The twin gaping muzzles pointed toward the black yard. They didn't speak. There was no need for hollow reassurances or desperate prayers. They were two ghosts haunting a structure that was about to become a tomb. The wind picked up outside. A low, mournful howl scraped across the dead plains, rattling the loose shingles on the roof. They sat in the pitch black. They listened to the heavy ticking of the brass clock. They waited for the sound of iron hooves to break the silence. The vibration started deep within the floorboards. A low, rhythmic thrumming that crept up through the rusted nails and into the thick leather soles of Elias's boots. The brass clock ticked heavily against the wall. Elias tightened his grip on the walnut stock of the Winchester. The sound materialized out of the suffocating blackness, the heavy grinding crunch of iron-shod hooves on dry gravel, the metallic clinking of silver bridle chains. A horse snorted a sharp, wet exhalation, tearing through the dry night air. 6 riders. They moved at a slow, deliberate walk, fanning out across the dead yard. No torches, no shouting, just the heavy, calculating approach of executioners confident in their absolute authority. They halted exactly between the dead oak and the hitching post. A match flared in the dark. The tiny yellow flame illuminated Vance's thick, bearded jaw as he drew heavily on a cigar. He let the match drop into the dust. "Burn it all!" Vance's voice grated a low rumble cutting through the heavy air. 2 riders spurred their mounts forward. The lead horse's chest hit the invisible taut copper wire. The tension snapped. The iron friction match struck the coarse sandpaper nailed to the oak. A microscopic red spark leaped into the night. It met the heavy, invisible vapor hanging over the buried glass jar. The dark ripped open. A column of blinding liquid fire erupted from the earth. The viscous amber fluid ignited with a deafening roar, splattering across the 2 led horses and their riders. The flames burned a brilliant, unnatural, white-hot orange, casting long, grotesque shadows against the cabin walls. The horses shrieked a raw, tearing sound of pure agony and reared high, throwing their riders into the burning dirt. The chemical fire clung to canvas dusters and leather saddles, consuming them at 400 degrees. The smell of roasting meat and scorching hair flooded the yard. The homestead transformed into a chaotic strobe of violence. Elias stood up from the oak chair. He stepped into the flickering orange light. He leveled the heavy barrel of the Winchester through the shattered pane of the front window. He tracked a man struggling to control his panicked roan in the shifting firelight. Elias squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked hard against his bruised shoulder, sending a jagged spike of pain down his collarbone. The sharp crack severed the screaming. The man folded completely over his saddle horn and tumbled into the dust. Elias racked the lever. Clack, clack. A hot brass casing spun onto the floorboards, burning a small black ring into the pine. He fired again. Another dark shape dropped heavily into the mesquite brush. Return fire hammered the cabin. Heavy lead slugs tore through the dry pine siding with deafening thuds. Splinters rained down across the room like wooden shrapnel. The remaining window glass dissolved into sharp, glittering shards that dusted the floorboards. The air inside the cabin grew thick, choking on the bitter scent of gray cordite and pulverized plaster. "They are pushing the steps." Elias rasped his voice, barely audible over the roar of the gunfire. 3 men abandoned their panicked mounts. They sprinted through the swirling smoke, heavy revolvers spitting flashes of fire toward the window. Their boots hit the bottom riser of the porch stairs. The warped wood groaned under the sudden combined weight of 3 desperate men. Clara knelt in the dark beneath the windowsill. She didn't flinch as a lead slug punched through the wall inches above her head. She kept her eyes locked on the raw copper wires resting on the pine plank. Her breathing maintained a slow, measured cadence against the deafening chaos. She held the thick black rubber wire between her bandaged thumb and forefinger. She pressed the bare copper against the negative terminal of the dry cell battery. The earth heaved. The 3 sticks of sweating dynamite buried beneath the porch detonated. The concussive wave hit the cabin like a physical blow, bowing the heavy log walls inward. A blinding flash of yellow light illuminated every crack in the mortar. The entire front porch ceased to exist. It atomized into a lethal, expanding cloud of splintered pine, rusted iron nails, and pulverized rock. The 3 men were swallowed entirely by the shock wave thrown backward into the dark yard as lifeless, broken weight. The blast knocked Elias to his knees. His ears rang a high, continuous pitch that drowned out the crackle of the burning yard. He tasted copper and ash on his tongue. He shook his head, fighting the heavy disorientation clouding his vision. He turned. Clara was already moving. A heavy boot kicked the rear door. The rusted iron hinges screamed in protest. A man shoved his entire weight against the timber, trying to breach the back of the cabin, while the front dissolved in smoke. His boot hit the slick black pool of lamp oil spreading across the wooden threshold. He lost his footing instantly. His heavy frame crashed hard against the doorframe, his revolver clattering onto the floorboards, sliding into the darkness. Clara stepped out of the shadows. She stood directly over him. The twin 8-inch barrels of the sawed-off 10-gauge pointed straight downward at his chest. The man looked up, his face smeared with black oil and sweat. He opened his mouth. Clara pulled both triggers. The roar was apocalyptic in the confined space of the kitchen. The brutal recoil threw Clara a half-step backward, but she kept her footing, her boots planting firmly on the boards. A massive, suffocating cloud of white smoke filled the room. The man in the doorway was gone, replaced by a devastating wet ruin scattered across the shattered back steps. Silence slammed back down on the homestead. It was a heavy, ringing void, broken only by the crackle of the chemical fire in the yard and the hiss of burning wood. Elias slowly stood up. He lowered the smoking barrel of the Winchester. He looked through the drifting smoke at Clara. She broke open the breech of the shotgun. 2 thick, empty red paper husks popped out, smoking heavily as they hit the floor. She reached deep into her apron, pulled 2 fresh shells, and slid them into the chambers with a definitive metallic click. She snapped the breech closed. Her hands, wrapped in dirty, blood-stained bandages, did not tremble. Her pale blue eyes caught the flickering firelight from the yard. They were completely devoid of pity, reflecting only the cold, hard arithmetic of survival. Elias wiped a smear of soot and blood from his jaw. The fragile city girl was an illusion buried under the rubble. In her place stood an absolute equalizer. He gave a slow, grim nod, sealing the violent pact forged in the ash. Dawn did not break. It bled. A bruised light crept over the eastern ridge, illuminating the butchery in the yard. Greasy smoke hung low, trapped by the heavy morning air. The homestead was a shattered carcass of splintered pine-scorched earth and pulverized stone. Where the porch had stood, a jagged crater marred the hardpan. 3 bodies lay tangled in the debris, coated in gray dust. Near the dead oak, the blackened remains of horses and riders smoked quietly, the chemical fire exhausted. The stench of copper, charred meat, and raw sulfur coated the back of the throat. Elias stepped through the shattered doorframe. His boots crunched over broken glass and brass casings. His right arm hung uselessly, the crude bandages soaked through with fresh crimson. He scanned the carnage, counting the dead. 5. Vance was among the ash by the oak, his silver watch chain melted into his breastbone. Clara stepped into the pale light. Her face was a mask of gray soot and dried sweat. She held 2 chipped tin cups. Thin tendrils of steam rose from the dark, muddy liquid inside. She walked to the edge of the ruined threshold and held out a cup. Elias looked at her hands. The bandages were stained black with gunpowder and lamp oil. He reached out with his left hand, his calloused fingers brushing against her knuckles. The heat of the tin seeped into his skin. No words broke the heavy silence. Clara didn't ask if it was over. Elias didn't offer a hollow prayer. He simply raised the bitter chicory to his lips and drank. He met her gaze over the rim. Her pale blue eyes were uncompromising. The desert hadn't broken her. It had only revealed the iron underneath. They stood together in the ruins, bound by a brutal, unspoken covenant, watching the sun rise. The dust settles over the ruined homestead, but the scent of burnt powder and scorched earth never truly leaves the soil. Elias and Clara survived the night. They did not do it with prayers or quiet endurance. They survived through a brutal, calculated violence that matched the unforgiving cruelty of the wasteland itself. They turned their home into a slaughterhouse to protect what little they had. But it leaves a heavy weight hanging in the still desert air. When the law is nothing but empty wind and survival demands you become the very monster you are fighting, does the blood on your hands ever wash clean? Is absolute ruthlessness, when used to protect your own, still a form of justice? Or is it just another shade of damnation? Leave your thoughts down in the dirt of the comment section. Let me know where you draw the line. If you have a taste for stories forged in the severe heat, where flawed people are pushed to the absolute brink, pull up a chair. Leave a like on the video. Subscribe to Iron Resolve Tales. We keep the fire burning and the coffee black. Until the next rider comes over the ridge, keep your powder dry.